Welcome, everybody, to the podcast Your Place or Mine with me, John Goodall. I'm the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Asset. I'm a visiting professor of architecture at the University of Cambridge and publisher of Triglyph Books.
The podcast is about people and places and things, the things that we visit. We discuss them and their history. And Clive and I spend a lot of time travelling around and looking at things, and this is somehow meant to represent some of the conversations we have in the car on the way back.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes John is going to choose the subject, and sometimes I'm going to choose the subject. And that's why it's called, John,
Your Place or Mine.
Handle, Wipe on Pod.
And what are we going to be talking about today, Clive?
Well, today is my subject, and that's Sir Edwin Lutyens, greatest British architect, on whom I've just written a book of that title. And so...
with a question mark at the end, it should be said.
It is with a question mark, and we could discuss the question mark.
And we're going to talk about him really through the prism of the people who we think are foundational to his remarkable career as an architect. And the person we're going to choose to look at today, Clive, is...
Well, she's a very remarkable woman, Gertrude Jekyll.
A massive personality and someone who, yes, is clearly crucial to the beginning of his career, when he's a figure who starts really with very little experience. And I think she's someone who deeply informs the way he thinks about buildings and makes his buildings interesting, actually, early on.
Yes, that's absolutely true. He was a brilliant young man, but she really moulded him and made him, as we'll find in part two.
So we're going to begin, because this is the first of the series we're going to look at, we're going to begin, though, with a brief introduction to Lutyens' early career. And first of all, very briefly, Clive, because it's going to trespass otherwise on later episodes.
Yes.
Why is he important?
Well, I think he's very important because, for one thing, he was a very prolific architect. He got going at an extremely young age for an architect, which was 19. And so he built a huge number of buildings. The Lutyens Trust keeps a gazetteer of all Lutyens' work, has got over 800 entries, which is an enormous number. And some of them, these were huge buildings, like the Viceroy's House in New Delhi, Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is bigger than Versailles, and some of them were tiny. There's a reservoir head on Dartmoor called the Pimple, as its name suggests, pretty small. And he built lots of different types of buildings. But I think really the two things I would particularly say within that is that some of the buildings were of great emotional resonance to his contemporaries. He was doing things which were very important to them, but also...
I mean, isn't he someone who sort of fits in... He's both someone who's achieves greatness and has greatness thrust upon him. I mean, in the sense that he's responding to things that are going on in the world around him. And I always tend to say that the thing that democratises his name is the First World War memorials, which he's so closely involved with.
Yes, I think that's true.
And that...
that's a very good example of something which was an important need for the nation. There weren't really war memorials in the way that there were after the First World War was what called into being this huge demand that there was for war memorials, both and battlefield cemeteries in France, which are so moving with all these seas of white headstones and so on. But personal memorials. Everybody wanted to remember the First World War, which was thought to be the war to
end all wars. And he gives voice to that, and that turns him from being... I mean, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, isn't it, to say, but I mean, it's almost as though, if he'd stopped work in, 1905, we would think of him just as a talented designer of luxury houses for the very rich, and that he's turned partly by the creation of war memorials into a household name, and he's articulating something, this deep-seated spiritual unease, though curiously in a way that is agnostic, isn't it? It's not. It's not overtly.
He didn't plaster them with religious symbols at all. That wasn't his idea. He saw himself as being a humanist, and I think that might have been a reflection of the humanism of the Renaissance, even. Because he by humanist in architecture, he meant that he liked architecture built out of familiar, friendly materials, as he saw it, like brick and stone and slate, which were in proportion with the human body. But also, in the case of war memorials, they were abstract. He had a great sense of abstract architecture. And I think the other thing, which leads on to the other thing I was going to say about him, which I think is why he's so important, is that he moves architecture onwards. He not only does all these different new types of buildings which were needed, but he does them in new ways.
He's an abstract. I mean, his the great game, as he calls it, isn't it? His classicism, but he does it in an abstracted way.
And classicism, the history of classicism goes back for 2,000 years, but he moves it on. He's not just
copying details,
exactly,
and, assembling things from
exactly.
a group of parts. It's and one of the things we're going to go on and talk about is his deep interest in geometry. And I think what you've touched on is really important, isn't it? That something like the cenotaph, it's simply "to the glorious dead," as the inscription says, and it's filled with subtle geometric forms. There are no straight lines in it, but it's not actually telling you anything. It doesn't have any clear. It's not clearly articulating a message. It's almost a vessel that you can fill with your own feelings.
Yes.
You can see in it what you want, and that's what he did so powerfully through his abstraction.
And I think the extraordinary thing about it is that although this is a very abstract building, which is the result of lots of very elaborate mathematical calculations. Quite where he got this maths from, we don't know, but he covered 36 pages of his notebook in working it all out. But it's a democratic, it's a populist building, if you like. It was erected, the original cenotaph was erected very, very quickly, just as somewhere that was needed for the peace parade.
In canvas and wood, no less.
Yes, and plaster and stuff, it was temporary. But it was converted into stone because so many people, it was rather like the death of Princess Diana when there was a tsunami of flowers which washed up against the gates of Kensington Palace. It was the same thing with the cenotaph. People were leaving these tributes for however much they could afford. People of all kinds, including very poor people, as there were in the Edwardian age or just post-Edwardian age, and that's what made the authorities decide. Well, we haven't had one of these before, but we better
make it permanent.
Turn it into stone.
Well, we're going to look at the war memorials in another episode in more detail, and they're fascinating subject. But we want to introduce him first of all in the first half of this podcast, really as a child. Where he comes from, who he is. So, Clive, can you just say a little bit about the family he's born into and his parents? Who are they?
Yes. Well, he was born in 1869 into a family. A father who'd been in the army. And when he was in the army, it's interesting that he had invented a kind of range finder.
For the artillery? For
the artillery, which must have involved maths. So Lutyens' father, Charles Lutyens, must have been pretty good at maths. Anyway, he was in the army, and
but he fancies himself as a painter, doesn't he?
He did. He wanted to leave the army to become a painter, and he particularly admired Edwin Landseer, who was a phenomenon of Victorian art, who became very rich. He was very socially accepted. He was the lover of the Duchess of Bedford and had children with her, for example. He became a bit rackety and a bit drunk by the end of his life.
And crucially, also, he's an artist of animals.
He's an artist
Landseer.
of animals. Charles Lutyens loved horses.
But Lutyens himself, Edwin Lutyens, is called Edwin Landseer Lutyens, which is a kind of acknowledgement of that fascination, isn't it?
Yes.
And
Lutyens' mother,
who
grew up in Ireland and was a Roman Catholic, became a sort of evangelical Protestant, actually didn't like all this sort of thing at all. And Landseer, it's said, had offered to adopt one of the children from this large family. It was a large family. It was a kind of gentleman's family.
This is Lutyens' family.
Lutyens' family. But it had a lot of children and no money.
How many children?
It had 13 children. I think Lutyens was number 10. So it was sort of a bit rackety, and it got worse. The family money ran out and all that. And so, they're quite hard up. And when Lutyens was growing up, for one thing, he didn't go to school because
he's sickly. I mean,
he was sickly.
He's a sickly child. But I mean, but he's number 10 of all these different children.
Yes.
He has a father who's becoming increasingly eccentric and unsuccessful as a painter.
Yes.
He has a mother who's clearly a very formative figure in his life.
Yes, he loved his mother very much.
She's a very disciplinarian, I don't know, or not really, I don't know.
I don't know that I got the sense that she, in reading about her, that she was a disciplinarian. I think that she was, very loving, and she had all these children, and she probably kept this family together.
Yes.
I think that when Lutyens was a young man, this family became an increasing embarrassment to him, and I think that it sort of almost represented everything he didn't like, because he loved order. I mean, this may have been a reaction against his rather chaotic family, and particularly domestic order. These things were very important for him. Strangely, or perhaps, in the workings of things, it's not so strange, but he never achieved it in his own household.
Oh, goodness me.
Although he became very successful.
He never did that. But so he has a number of brothers and a number of sisters. Most of his brothers go off to school. They go to Westminster, don't they?
Yes, they do. And they were boarders, and that's what people did if you came from this sort of family.
So is he growing up in a predominantly female household, in fact, with his sisters? Or do they go off to
that's
school?
interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, a lot of Victorian households were. There were a lot of sort of spare women around, because they hadn't got married. They were spinsters. They hadn't found a husband who was rich enough to take them on, or a lot of people died young. So there were a lot of widows. So Victorian households often were female. I hadn't thought of that, but it might well have been. But he also, because he didn't go to school, he spent a lot of time in the place. Well, he was born in Onslow Square, but in London. And when he was a boy, his parents, his father, loved hunting. I think that any Victorian parent was conscious of the terrible air of London, because it was all very, very smoky. And so his mother would have liked the health of going to the Surrey Hills.
Which are then a remote place before the railways, or as the railways...
The railways were there, and so more and more people, but it was all quite arty, it's Tennyson and Conan Doyle, writers, but also painters like Helen Allingham. They were going to Surrey. It was somewhere which was despised in the Georgian period because it was all heathy. Yeah. So it wasn't good agricultural land, it was barren. In fact, they talk about these pine barrens, which meant there's nothing growing there. But to the Victorians, they thought that, one, it was all rather lovely, pretty, but two, these piney, quick-draining landscapes were thought to be very healthy.
And it's in such easy striking distance of London by railway.
Yes, exactly, and that was the new thing.
So it's also, as it were, initially an artist colony, but then it becomes increasingly rich, and that's something indeed that Lutyens in his professional career rides on, isn't it? It's the gentrification of a relative rural backwater very close to London.
As we'll see in part two, some people, there were two views about it. I mean, Lutyens was certainly getting lots of commissions, but equally there were two views about the social changes that were taking place
within it and how they divided.
So park that thought.
And so a young, sickly boy, he has an opportunity to roam the Surrey countryside, and he starts looking at buildings. Clearly, he becomes he is very interested in a builder's yard near his house.
I mean, he thought that he had a terribly good. I mean, he thought that his brothers had gone off and they'd learnt through books, but he'd learned through looking, and he looked at all these buildings. And yes, it's absolutely true that he hung around builders' yards and carpenter shops and that kind of thing.
Where he learned about materials and about construction.
Yes, and the construction, I mean, the carpenters' manuals of the day are full of sort of mathematical calculations, or sort of geometrical, because that's what you needed to do in carpentry. So that's another place he could have been introduced to maths.
It's a lot of practical geometry too. I mean, laying out timbers for cutting. There are all these sort of clever tricks, aren't there, for how do you get a perpendicular line and how do you get a 45-degree angle. And it's all just practical geometry straight from the depths of the Middle Ages, in fact, really.
Yes. And these people who weren't, in conventional terms, very highly educated, had a mastery of this sort of practical mathematics.
But also one of the fascinating things is he's involved in drawing with bar of soap and glass. It seems such an extraordinary thing. It's nothing you've ever tried, is it? I've never tried it.
I haven't tried, but I know somebody who has tried, and it's very difficult, apparently. But I suppose you can imagine it. You had to sharpen the soap in the first instance so that it made a point. And then it was a bit like tracing. You held the sheet of glass up to your subject, and you made a few marks, or Lutyens made a few marks with a piece of sharpened soap. And For him, it was enough. I mean, the soap was obviously then washed off the glass, and he could do something else. But he had a very visually retentive memory, so that was enough. He'd internalised these forms, which was something he could draw on in his later career.
So in the process, effectively, of drawing, he was putting it all in his mind, and then he could sum up these things. So he's looking at materials and builders' yards, he's learning about the practicalities of construction, and then he's also looking at these buildings, and presumably in Surrey when he's there, the buildings are nearly all slightly ramshackle, inherited buildings. I mean,
yes.
It's actually, a kind of, dare I say it, late medieval, 17th, 18th century timber frame buildings, presumably.
Oh, yes, totally. That's exactly what it was. The village Thursley, where he grew up, you can see that. I mean, there's a house just opposite the church, which is a medieval building. You can see it's a medieval building from the way the door is placed and how the roofs are structured, but it's been refaced in the late 17th century, I should think. And that's the sort of thing that Lutyens was very aware of and which he loved. It was kind of cosy. These buildings of human scale which had gone through... Which had
evolved, rather than just being created at one moment in time, but had been improved and adapted.
They'd kind of been treasured over centuries. And I think he responded to that very much. And that became the language of his early architecture, really.
One thing, going back to his family, I mean, it is really interesting to think of him as, presumably in a largely female household, but it's something that I think that shapes his later career, isn't it? That he finds the company of men quite difficult.
Yes.
I mean, and I think it's an important point to make, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. I mean, Lutyens was immensely good fun. He was whimsical. He was rather childish spirit in a way, but his mind was very, very quick, and he told loads of jokes. He could, he made up little limericks. He told off-the-cuff jokes. He told little stories. If I may just trespass on your patience, John, by telling you.
Keep it short.
Well, he had a commission from Sir George Sitwell, who was the father of Osbert Sitwell and Sacheverell Sitwell and Edith Sitwell, these brilliant young people in the 20s. But George Sitwell they rather laughed at their old father. Anyway, he had got Lutyens up to Renishaw, which was their house, and Osbert Sitwell, as a little boy, remembers hiding behind an armchair or something, and there he was in the drawing room, and Lutyens walked in, and he watched Lutyens, and he sat down on a sofa, and he noticed that the cover of the sofa was split, and he picked a lock of horsehair, a curl of horsehair, off this sofa, and he went over to a bureau, found a piece of paper, he made a screw of paper, and he scribbled something on it, threw it to the back of the bureau. And after he'd gone out, Osbert Sitwell went up to the bureau, and he took out this paper, and he unwrapped it, and he found written on the piece of paper was a lock of Marie Antoinette's hair cut off shortly after she had been guillotined.
It's very...
Lutyens planted this as something that he presumably thought might be discovered at some distant point in the future, and everybody would probably think it was true.
Yeah, it's very childish in a way, but very funny too, isn't it? So you're creating a little relic.
Yeah, and so people absolutely... some people found him... Well, he was very funny. Some found him too funny. And if they sat next to him at the Garrick Club, their jaws were aching by the end of the evening. They all found it a bit too much. But... at the same time, I think, if I may be sort of psychological for a moment, I think the reason that it was a defence. He was actually intensely shy, and he was particularly shy with other men because he hadn't gone to school with them. There was no rough and tumble, really, in his childhood. You were probably right, John, there was probably female, his upbringing, because he had a lot of mentors who were older women. But it was a bit of an obstacle into his practice in some ways. For example, one of his contemporaries was Herbert Baker, a great friend of Lutyens at one point, who had a very, very, very successful career. But it's observable that Herbert Baker, who came from a similar background, a similar sort of background. I mean, his dad wasn't an artist or anything like that, but he came from a gentry background, not particularly well off, but he had gone to Tunbridge School.
And he's a great cricketer
And he was a fantastic
sportsman.
athlete and sportsman. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. In fact, I think the whole of the Baker family were. So all these tall young men who were all playing cricket.
Playing up the game, yes, play
And
up.
actually very much playing by the rules of the game. But they could get on tremendously well, or Baker could, when it came to working committees. He understood how people's minds worked, and he played by the rules. Lutyens didn't. And he could get into difficulties over that. That was something he wasn't awfully good at doing.
Yeah, you can imagine. Well, you get the sense, indeed, that some people really got on with him and other people did not. I mean, another thing that has been commented about him, I think, by his contemporaries, is the way that he's actually quite inarticulate until he has a pencil in his hand.
That's true. He was incredibly good at drawing of all kinds. Obviously, drawing little houses but doodles and funny things.
I suppose it's a curiosity that with Lutyens, I mean, obviously he produces formal designs and drawings, but actually nearly all the drawings that you associate with him, or at least I associate with him, are actually sketches of things. I mean, sketches of buildings, but also these very Edward Lear-like cartoon sketches in letters. He's very playful, isn't he, in the way that he annotates letters, turns,
yes.
and it is just like Edward Lear, these funny images. And he, as an abstract classicist, I think it's so funny that he reduces himself in these drawings, in these cartoon drawings, to a circle with a pair of spectacles, and
Each of which were circular.
Each of which are circular. And there's a very funny signature in the guest book at one of his houses, Lambay Castle, in the Bay of Dublin, on an island, on Lambay Island, where he takes a line and turns it into a butler's tray and just has his head with two little circles for his spectacles and signs it underneath as a guest. And it immediately evokes him. He somehow simplifies even his own image into this almost geometric simplicity. It's very funny.
But immediately very funny.
It is. It's immediately very playful.
You can't help it. I mean, I described him as childish, and I think he was, in a sense. He didn't quite grow up in some ways, and he was very, very good with children. Strangely, not particularly his own children.
Yes, I mean, that's a fascinating point you mentioned to me before, that, in fact, he only sees, I mean, it's very Edwardian, he only sees his own children on Sundays. Is that
Well,
right?
it's incredibly surprising, but of course he was very, 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 very busy, and he worked all the time, really. I mean, he had a great need. He was driven financially to work because he had to, but he was also driven by his own sense of his own genius, essentially. He wanted to realise all these ideas that he had, and he would always work after dinner. He would work. His office was sometimes in his own house, and he would, he had dinner and then he went down to work again.
One of the draftsmen in his office, I think, recalls that he never saw Lutyens sit down, which
No,
is
he was a figure of great, great energy.
So he he drew standing up, he walked around the office, he looked at people's drawings, but he was always moving or always standing, and it's sort of fascinating to think.
But it's always struck me as a bit curious or unexpected that Lutyens' wife, Lady Emily, who became a theosophist, joined the spiritual movement at the turn of the 20th century, and she herself went off all over the place seeking enlightenment or working on behalf of this really rather bogus religion, which finally she thought was nonsense at the end of her life, but she was heavily involved with it for a long time. She appeared to behave in what we would now regard as being a completely irresponsible way.
Towards her children.
And, social services would have been involved, to be quite honest.
Because she really isn't around very much. I mean, neither of them can
they were sort of trailing along in her wake, but being just, discarded in very, very remote places as she went off somewhere else because, the spirit had somewhere. But they loved her.
The children loved her.
Yes.
Unless their father?
No, they regarded him, he was telling all these jokes and everything, and sort of slightly embarrassing dad. And they thought of him as working all the time and being sort of, this was snobbish of them, but, their mother was the daughter of an earl and he was a bit middle class.
It's really interesting, isn't it? But I mean, he with other people's children. I mean, so I'm struck by
He
how
was
many
brilliant.
how many anecdotes about Lutyens.
Very like Edward Lear, as you said.
And isn't it interesting how many anecdotes about Lutyens are actually related by people who were children when they met him?
Yes.
That there's another other very funny thing, isn't it? Asking people if they mind having an electric shock. and brave people would say no, 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 and he would get a box of matches and he would stick 2 matches in the top, and he would say, now take hold of one of the matches with your left hand, and the person would take hold of one match, and then he'd say, now very carefully take hold of the other match with your right hand. They take hold of it, and he'd say, now slowly raise your leg, and as they raised your leg, said, do you feel your leg being pulled? I mean, I seem to remember that is also an anecdote relayed through a child. I mean,
But he would introduce all these things into his architecture, which were for children.
Yes.
And, but John, we've got to start him on his career.
One of the things I suppose that we need to introduce, I mean, there is a breathtaking self-confidence about him as a young man. I mean,
Yes.
We've dealt with him, wandering in the Surrey hills, drawing things, being in builders' yards, absorbing all these things. But in fact, he goes then to South Kensington, doesn't he, very briefly?
Well, I think before that, I would just say that there he is in the Surrey hills, but this was not a kind of, I mean, it was a bit on its uppers, but it was still a family that was well connected. And, Lutyens' father got some commissions. And one of the commissions he got to paint a horse was from a family called Arbuthnot. And they kind of took up young Ned, who was immensely entertaining. They tell various stories about him, but they also describe him in his brother's clothes, because this big family, no money, he was always wearing his brother's handed-down clothes, which didn't really fit properly, and his hair was sticking out like a haystack. And they obviously liked him very much and found him very funny. But the Arbuthnot's were rich enough to employ the greatest domestic architect of the age, who was very, who was regarded almost as the god of architects, who was Richard Norman Shaw. And he came down and I think designed a wing of their house that he was going to build on. And they showed this to the drawings to Lutyens when he was about 16. And he looked at them and said, quite good, but couldn't he do this? And sort of made various improvements. This boy, who had no knowledge of anything, and of course, rather predictably, when they told Norman Shaw, thinking they'd be terribly impressed, he didn't think it was quite so great as they did. And Lutyens went off to see him, and there he was, wearing these ill-fitting clothes and borrowing the vicar's boots because he didn't have a pair of shoes smart enough for the occasion for him to go to London. And they didn't, they were really painful. So he was limping along. And he went to have an interview with Norman Shaw, and Norman Shaw asked him, how he thought what sort of architecture, the direction of architecture, or possibly about this wing, how it should be built. And he said, really, with extraordinary prescience in terms of the way architecture went, he said that they should be built much more, Norman Shaw should be building much more out of local materials. And these traditional materials, as Lutyens himself, I think he'd already, at this very young age, he began to make, put sidings on old barns for local farmers and that kind of thing.
So imitating this evolution of buildings.
Yes.
And isn't it interesting, because we would see today, looking back, we would see Norman Shaw and Lutyens as part of a single trajectory.
Well, Lutyens admired Norman Shaw very much.
Yeah.
I mean, can't emphasise too much that Norman Shaw was the king of architects at that time. And with Castle Drogo, a commission, 1912, in Devon, which its owner very much wanted to be a castle, a real castle built in the medieval way, which to a certain extent it was. But actually there was a very strong influence from a nearby house called Fleet, actually connecting back to Castle, to Lambay. To the castle on Lambay, which the clients there had taken Lutyens to see. But so Lutyens very much admired
Norman Shaw. So in Drogo, he's copying Shaw.
Yes.
But he doesn't get. He wants to be placed with Norman Shaw.
Yes.
As so. Just very quickly, he does this brief period learning more about architecture at South Kensington.
Yes, not architecture. I don't think it was architecture so much. Well, he went to an art school, and I think that he got a drawing prize, for example.
But he's only there very briefly.
Well, for a couple of years.
For a couple of years.
But he doesn't finish the course.
And then he goes on to he does get a placement within an architectural practice.
Yes, he doesn't get accepted by Norman Shaw, we wonder why.
No, indeed you do.
Not very surprised. But he does go to another very, very successful architect called Ernest George. And Ernest George was a great builder of houses, these enormous houses, huge country houses, very well planned for the needs of the day, but Lutyens later made fun of Ernest George.
They're sort of Queen Anne.
Well, he was building a lot in London in this so-called Queen Anne style, which was red brick and with a lot of Dutch gables, sort of Pont Street Dutch. I think Osbert Lancaster characterised it. So it was that sort of thing. But again, Herbert Baker, that's where he met Herbert Baker, because Herbert Baker was there. But Lutyens, where Herbert Baker was there for 8 years, Lutyens whizzed through like a flash of lightning in a single year.
And then, with breathtaking self-confidence...
At the age of 19, he got a very modest legacy and a family friend. Again, they had connections, this Lutyens family. A family friend commissioned Lutyens. I mean, it seems incredible. He never built anything before. He was commissioned to build a house. And on the strength of that, he opened
his own office.
But the striking thing about his early productions, I think, is that you wouldn't have predicted from them that he was going to be the genius that he developed in his later career. And why was that, John?
Well, we're going to find out in part 2, aren't we? Because one of the events on which I think his whole professional life turns on is a tea party in which he is introduced to a really exceptional woman. We've already mentioned Gertrude Jekyll, and we're going to hear about what she does and how she shapes his career in part 2 of the podcast. Right, welcome back. And we're now going to turn to the second part of this analysis of Lutyens' early career with this crucial figure who really is fundamental to his understanding of architecture and how it sits in landscape. And this is Gertrude Jekyll. So, Clive, can you give us a little bit of background about who she is and where she comes from? Because she's a woman from a totally different generation, and also, crucially, how they meet.
Yes, well, the Tea Party. But Gertrude Jekyll, she was born in 1843. Lutyens was born in 1869. So there's 25 or 26 years between them. She was much older. And so it's a sort of unlikely friendship that they made, but they found something very profound in each other, and she remained very important to him for all her life. And he was being a very playful character. He caricatured her, both in his letters to his wife, Lady Emily, and in drawings, for whom she was the drawings sometimes show her as being a sort of rather cottage loaf kind of lady. I mean, she was only in her, I think, 40s and so on when Lutyens met her, but still, she was a single lady of determined fixed habits, and did look a bit like a cottage loaf. She was a bit dumpy, but sometimes also he drew her flying through the air as a fairy godmother waving a wand.
He calls her Bumps, doesn't he?
Aunt Bumps was his name.
Do you think she knows that she's
Well,
known
I'm
as
not
Bumps?
quite sure about that. I think she's quite formidable, really. The important thing about her was that she was absolutely steeped in arts and crafts. I was going to say the arts and crafts movement, but she wasn't an architect, for example, but she was a great craftswoman. But I don't, to be part of this movement, I think she very much thought for herself as well.
So just very quickly, as it were, before Lutyens meets her, we'll talk about their meeting in a moment, because I think it's somehow very evocative understanding the circumstances in which they met and what happened. But I mean, she is grown up in the 1850s and the 1860s, as it were, as a young adult. She's in a really interesting circle herself. She's also genteel background, but she's a traveller, isn't she?
I think the backgrounds were, in a sense, not dissimilar. I mean, they were both, broadly speaking, upper middle class, professional. Her father had been in the army, like Lutyens' father. Her brother was in the army. He came out as Colonel Herbert Jekyll. He then was in the civil service. So they were sort of at the same level of society, except there was a difference in income. But her family were extremely well connected, and it was sort of arty and artistic circles that her father liked.
There's a connection with this rather wonderfully named Brabazon.
Sir Hercules Brabazon.
Who's a brilliant watercolourist.
Oh, wonderful watercolourist in the spirit of Turner. He really is marvellous. But because he was a baronet and well off, he didn't need to sell them, so he didn't have the reputation he might have done. But Brabby, she called him Brabby.
And they travelled together, did they, or not?
I am pretty sure that they did. I mean, she travelled very widely when she was a young woman.
And she collects plants. I mean, this doesn't she? She
Yes.
travelled really widely, doesn't she?
Yes, she does. And she travels with her sketching materials. And, she must have been... she wasn't the dumpy figure that we picture her as through Lutyens' drawings. Always, she'd been in her 20s and she'd ridden side saddle and looked rather good on a horse, So she'd been a young woman and she did this very intrepid travelling. But there's a sketch of her by one of her friends showing Miss Jekyll in full marching order. And she's going out and she's still got some easels and paint boxes and things strapped around her person. So she was, sort of formidable.
Is this in the Middle East? Where is she?
I think, yes, either in the Middle East or somewhere like Corfu but she travelled widely around the Mediterranean, the Near East, that sort of thing.
And she must, very early on, have developed an intense interest in plants. I mean, that is clearly one of the things that really... She collects plants when she travels, and she... I don't know, what her watercolours, are they topographical or are they of plants? Do you know?
I think topographical, I think. But she was not only doing that sort of thing, which other ladies did, but she became a craftswoman of a very high order. I mean, it wasn't just... Well, of course, there were a lot of ladies who did what were in previous generations patronisingly referred to as ladies' work, which was sort of making things out of shells or whatnot. And of course, needlework was to a high standard very often, but Gertrude Jekyll was absolutely exceptional. She mastered many crafts to do with metals, to do with wood, to do with embroidery. She designed embroidery and made it. And it was something which she sort of, became a bit like Liberties. I mean, because she produced these things, not on a vast scale, but she did sell them.
And they are of very high quality, aren't they? I mean,
very high quality.
Inlays of wood. I mean,
yes.
you would describe her as a craftswoman, wouldn't you? I mean,
yes, she was. I'm not sure that the extent to which she sold them when she was young, because she didn't have to, but it became, and particularly her gardening became, a sort of one-woman industry for her. She knew William Morris, for example,
who was a very formative influence.
Yes, on the arts and crafts movement, and indeed corresponded and she certainly knew him to an extent. John Ruskin, who was the sort of founder of all these ideas that the salvation of everything, the human soul, British civilization, lay in the crafts.
And peeling back the industrial order and
putting this tide of industrialism at arm's length. Of course, hopeless, because all the products of the arts and crafts movement were too expensive for ordinary people to afford.
She is a photographer, isn't she? That's another... I mean, the two things that I think are really surprising about her is that, first of all, she's quite a celebrated journalist in her own day, isn't
yes.
she? She's writing a lot. Though maybe just me, I don't think of her as producing books and articles, but in fact she does.
Well, she does.
She's a photographer with her own development. She has her own little photo room, doesn't she, in the bottom of her own house. So she's a skilled photographer as well.
Yes. I mean, she didn't do anything to a poor standard. I mean, everything was done in the best possible way. But I think it's important to set her in Surrey, because these were two things that she and Lutyens shared.
She has a family house there, doesn't she? That
yes.
Her mother lives there. Is that
yes,
right?
Yes. Her father and family, they lived in, I think, Kensington or somewhere like that, and so they were in London, but then they got a house in Surrey when she was a little girl, I think, and she identified to an extent that was difficult to describe with Surrey. Her father, at a later point, maybe that they only rented, this happened a lot in Victorian England, but anyway, for some reason they moved to Berkshire, which isn't that far away, but Gertrude Jekyll regarded that as being a period of exile
From her homeland.
from
her
this
roots.
place that she really, really loved. And after her father's death, her brother, Herbert, who himself was a woodworker, although he was, you wouldn't have thought it to look at him, as it were, because he was, he was a retired army person and civil servant. But, he did a lot of things with his hands. Anyway, he employed a great architect called J.J. Stevenson to build a house for...
Great architect may be a bit of an exaggeration. Or not, is that unjust?
Steady.
J.J. Stevens. Anyway, yes.
Well, he was a big figure in the aesthetic revival and the Queen Anne revival, as it was called. Let's not go down that particular
Like
rabbit
Petto and George, in fact, curiously.
Yes, that's true. Actually, well, that is very
Like
true.
Lutyens' own office of training.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And so, she identifies very closely with Surrey.
But he was a top architect, I think we could say. He picked a good architect, and he built this house for Gertrude and her mother, although it was his house. And Gertrude loved it. It was called Munstead House. It was near Godalming. And one of the things that Gertrude did, at sort of, I suppose she must have been in her 30s, probably something like that, she bought a patch of land which was next door to Munstead House. And this she developed as a garden. And it was in a stretch of Surrey Heath, which people had previously, as I was saying before, thought of as being very unproductive. But she loved it because it reminded her of this landscape of the Mediterranean.
Which she'd travelled in so widely and collected in.
She then developed this language of gardening, which was partly kind of using cottagey native plants, but also introducing these exotic plants that, exotic in the sense that they weren't native, that she'd seen on her travels. And she was very skilled as a plantswoman, as much as she was anything else. And she was a great friend of William Robinson, who was a gardener who had introduced a completely new way of thinking about gardens. Victorian gardens were all about parterres and bedding out and making rather gaudy patterns.
Intensely managed, yes.
With tons and tons of plants that have been brought out of the greenhouse, strong colours.
Regimented
utterly regimented.
In these very highly ordered beds. And he had a more naturalistic approach to gardens.
Yes, it was essentially the wild garden. That was his phrase. And I think he wrote a book called that. He wanted gardens to be, an approach to their natural state as much as they could be.
And so it's also her brother's construction of this house for her mother and herself that she realises she has this garden, but then she realises that when her mother dies, she's going to have to move out of that house, and that is going to be the seed or a situation which involves Lutyens. Because can you paint the picture of what we know of their first meeting?
Well, that is absolutely true, because I'm sure that Herbert would have been happy for Gertrude to go on living at Munstead House, but she wanted to be independent, and to achieve that independence, the family was quite well off, but it wasn't that well off. She had to create her own income, and so she was actually a pioneer businesswoman, if you like. It was a business that she ran. Anyway, she had to do that, and she was a master of all these domestic crafts, which she sold, I suspect, on quite a small scale, but she made them for sale, not just to give, to put in bazaars for raising money for the local church or something. This was a serious enterprise. But she could do everything. She had a lot of ideas, and she could do everything except actually build a house, design a house herself. And so I think she was on the lookout for an architect. And there was a tea party which Lutyens went to, this lanky.
It's quite unlike the Lutyens of later life, with bald and with two poppled glasses. He's a lank, thin,
yes,
richly haired,
young totally man. Sort of wearing his brother's clothes and things. So scruffy. Actually, Lutyens, people said he remained scruffy, and even in terms of his hands, because he was always smoking a pipe, or if he wasn't smoking a pipe, he was drawing, and so his hands were rather grimy. So that's how he presented, so to speak. But yes, he was young, and he was very shy, but very witty, and clearly, if you got through the shyness, he was very good fun. But they didn't really speak much at this tea party. But just as Gertrude Jekyll was getting into her pony cart to go home, she had one foot on the step. She said, words to the effect, you want to be an architect? come and see me tomorrow morning at Munstead House. So he did.
Amazing. Nobody's ever done that to me.
No, if only. Wouldn't that be a great thing? But she then, she found that he was just what she needed, because he was a young man. He opened his office. He knew how to build things, but
he had no real depth to his understanding what he was doing at that point.
No, not at all. I think that there's a very funny account of Chinthurst Hill written by an architect called Harry Goodhart Rendell, who grew up in Chinthurst Hill because his mother bought it. She wasn't the person who'd built it. But it was this enormous house, and as a boy, Goodhart Rendell, he absolutely adored it.
Because it was one of Lutyens' first houses.
Well, one of his very first houses was on this enormous scale, built for a very rich, curiously, again, a progressive type of person, because she was a lady doctor. I mean, that was really something for the 1890s. But it was on a huge scale, but it was absolutely derivative of Norman Shaw. But it was a bit of a muddle, to be quite truthful. I mean, it has flashes of things, but, it was basically, you wouldn't have predicted that the young man who designed this house was going to go on and have Lutyens' stellar career. But Gertrude Jekyll could introduce him to her philosophy of life and buildings, and also make huge connections, because she had a very big circle of friends and clients, indeed, her own clients for gardens.
And so they design together, don't they, effectively? I mean, it's Lutyens' house, but I mean, it's quite clear that she stamps all over it, doesn't she?
Yes.
Munstead Wood as her home and office and workspace.
Yes.
Crucially, all these things elided.
She turned to gardening because she was going a bit blind. So she had this rather dumpy figure and these very strong glasses. She was myopic. But yes, they did everything together. And her gardens, she designed the gardens, but there wouldn't have been a lot of money in that. She also supplied the plants, and so she had a nursery where she grew plants, and these gardens were on a big scale. So she was shipping out garden plants in large scale, but she could also supply lilies of the valley for people's dinner parties, to have on the table if they sent their footmen round. She had a little shop. She had a workroom. I mean, she got Lutyens to build this house called Munstead Wood, but it's a big house, but it's a big house because although it's for a single lady, but it's a big house because it contains her workroom, her dark room, her book room where she wrote her books and her articles, making money out of all these things, and there was a little shop where she could sell things.
And it's a really fascinating building, isn't it? All kinds of levels. I mean, one of the things that when I first went there I was absolutely staggered by was the quantity of stuff in it that she had made. I mean, some of the fixtures within it. One of my favourite details, indeed, going downstairs into the darkroom, immediately opposite the darkroom door, there is the wine cellar door, which is carved through by her as a sort of silhouette of grapes on a vine. Just a little window through the top of it. Yes. And it's quite clear, she has produced that, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
And as you say, that
and some inlay of Mother of Pearl.
Mother of Pearl, well, and the door, one of the doors to her study. I mean, again, it's sort of eye-catching, and these little things that she's obviously collected on her travels, or from, I don't know, maybe some antique dealer in London, probably little Japanese handles for things.
Yes.
I mean, there's something about the care with which the details have been chosen, and in some details fashioned by him that's very remarkable. But also it's the aspect of the house and the way that on one side it looks out entirely into woodlands, doesn't it?
Yes.
And then, but it also has a little formal side, sort of formal garden where the wings of the house go out, and there's a lean-to, and there's a stone inscribed with all the builders. I mean, again, the arts and crafts element is important. It is. What does that say?
Well, it's saying who's built the house, and I think it says, first of all, I don't think it says Edwin Lutyens. I think it says the master builder, and
right.
Lutyens is on it, but it's putting the craftsman first. This was very much her idea, and she got Lutyens to build a little house called the Hut before this big house, Munstead Wood, was built. And when the hut, which is towards Munstead House, I think, she walked to it, her route was through this woodland that you described. And of course she gardened the woodland with clematis growing up into the silver birch trees and these sort of cascading roses and the path, the sandy path, which had deep ruts from the carts in it, was planted with bulbs and that sort of thing. So anyway, she would walk to the house, and I think she walked to the house. She wanted to see it being built every day, which could have been a bit of a nightmare, possibly. But she describes in a book that she wrote not just what the art builders were doing, but, for example, the sound.
Yes,
of
with
bricks,
the scrape of the trowel.
and the slosh of the mortar. And, you wouldn't have thought you could create a sensuous sound picture
of a building, but she does. Yes, it's a really
from brick.
It is
the Surrey material of brick, which is what it was built out of local materials like Horsham stone and brick and tile.
But it's interesting that she evokes the building indeed not through appearance, which is what you would imagine.
No.
But evokes it as a building site through sound.
And another thing which is very, very typical is that there's a wonderful gallery upstairs, on one side of which is lined with these display cases, where she had these little collections that she had. But she describes how she could remember each of the oak trees when they were growing 17 years before, where they were, and they were cut down, and she watched them
being assembled into the cabinets.
Well, yes, having first been seasoned and all that, and then these very oak trees that she could remember growing a few miles away,
being turned into the house.
Yeah, so it's intensely arts and crafts with this identity with materials. But the other thing which is particular about Gertrude Jekyll, which is very, very strong, which I think I hesitated about saying that she's part of the arts and crafts movement, because there's something that was a bit particular to her, really, was that she had such a strong nostalgia for the old Surrey. She wasn't alone in doing this. There were other people. And somebody a writer who lived in Farnham, talked about the peasant civilization of the rural English. These were not terms that we would necessarily use today.
I suppose she could bond with Lutyens over that, because he knew it through and through as a child,
Yes.
having wandered through.
It was all about them. Yes, it was all around. It was all around, but it was going.
What's really interesting, I mean, one other thing that's worth saying about Munstead Wood is how peculiar the entrance to the house is. It's
Yes.
almost an introduction to a theme that runs right through Lutyens' architecture, is
Yes.
that you arrive at the house and it's a wall. It's
Yes.
not what you expect.
No.
It's playing with you as a visitor.
Yes.
And you have to, there's a sort of joke being played on you as you arrive.
Yes.
And you go in and immediately it's counterintuitive as to where you have a choice, don't you?
Yes.
You walk through and then the door is to your...
Not what you expect.
You pass through the wall and then the main door is on your right. So it's a very peculiar treatment where you're left guessing slightly where you should go. But also, I think with the garden, I mean, one of the themes that seems to run through all Lutyens' gardens with Jekyll is this idea of a naturalised garden, these washes of different colours, but it's somehow gardens tipped with architecture, that there is an architectural frame, particularly at the back of the house.
Yes.
That there's a sort of integration of the two, that the rooms and the building look out into the garden, but the garden also, in some curious way, responds to the house.
Yes, and that was a very big movement at the time, where lots of architects were writing books and thinking about how to integrate the garden with the house. And that was a kind of theme. Lutyens and Jekyll weren't the only people who were doing it, but...
And creating garden rooms, aren't they?
Garden rooms, yes, that was another thing. That again was a sort of idea of the time, and there were people who were writing about Italian gardens and Renaissance gardens with their topiary and things like that, and these garden rooms were a big theme. But Lutyens and Jekyll formed it wasn't really a partnership, but a sort of informal arrangement, and they went on to design over 100 gardens together. And Jekyll did the planting, and Lutyens did this geometrical structure of gardens with paths, with dry stone walls, with fountains, with niches, with circular windows in walls and things like that. And actually in Munstead Wood, in the wall you refer to, Jekyll's idea was you weren't allowed to drive up to the house. That was regarded as being a bit naff, even if you were in a sort of pony cart or something. If you were in a motor car, perish the thought.
Yeah, unthinkable.
That was one of these agents of change which she objected to very, very strongly. But you had to walk to the house. Anyway, then you get to this wall. But there's an arch in this wall, and it's stone. It's built out of this local stone. But there are kind of a sunburst of rays in tile going into the stone.
Around the arch, aren't there?
Around the arch.
And you feel as though Lutyens learns from her about how you create, an architectural shape to a garden, and then she creates, as I said, these washes of colours
Yes.
in it. It's a really interesting approach, and it informs his garden design throughout. I mean, his gardens are in a way very architectural.
Yes, that was his contribution.
Contribution to it, and in fact, I imagine if they'd not met, maybe her plantings would have been less architectural. I mean, it's an interesting.
I think that's very likely, and I think that equally his gardens wouldn't have had so many plants in them.
Well, he would have done what many contemporary architects do still to this day, which is not really grasp the nature of that relationship between the landscape and the house itself.
I think he would have been quite happy with something which was completely green.
Yeah, I know.
I suspect.
Yes.
But I should say in this relationship between Jekyll and Lutyens, I mean, she was a strong-minded woman, and sometimes the fur flew. They didn't always agree. And sometimes, I think it was a good lesson, because mostly the client got her way. Well, that's a very good lesson to learn. But sometimes Lutyens did, and sometimes he was right, this young man. But really in the course of this, kind of vigorously argued, and they were all the time going off and looking at things in the lanes and whatnot, with a sort of both of these two pairs of eyes. You can imagine it must have been very fun, but lots of observation was going
incisive,
on. Exactly, and lots of chats which were also instructive. And Lutyens was a very, very quick learner. And at the end of this process of designing this house, he had got the hang of what Gertrude Jekyll was all about, her philosophy, and he could take it and run with it and do things that were quite different, but using these elements.
The intellectual tools she'd helped develop, really.
Exactly, and the visual. I think she must have opened a door in a sense, because he knew about all these things, but he didn't use about motifs from what we would now call vernacular. That's homely farmhouses and cottages and these sort of local barns and things. He knew all about that because he'd grown up amongst them, but he didn't use it so much in his early buildings. But he'd sort of been shown that these had a real value about Gertrude Jekyll, and then he was off. He could do it.
Well, all this is really interesting because it leads perfectly to the next in the series, in a way, that we're going to talk about, which is a thing about Edward Hudson, who is the founding editor of Country Life magazine.
Founding proprietor, perhaps.
Proprietor, no, that's true. And that is so crucial because it allows Lutyens, he gets a magazine on Lutyens's side, and the magazine promotes his architecture using this new technology of high printed photographic images, and this new and successful magazine basically comes to promote him. And
yes.
It's a change that's taking place in across the architectural world at this moment in time, but it means that Lutyens has his own magazine.
I think it's very modern, and there were other magazines, other architects doing it, as no doubt we'll discuss next week, but I think it's worth saying that this makes Lutyens quite a modern figure, understanding the importance of PR.
And promoting his own buildings. And he is, that connection to Hudson is through Jekyll, and it is that trinity of figures.
Exactly.
Are really the sort of, it's formative for
key.
So you can't really understand.
With his wife, Lady Emily.
With his wife, Lady Emily, who we will also, another really fascinating figure who we will talk about, has her own episode. Excellent, well, we look forward to it.